I'm Alex Weiser, YIVO's Director of Public Programs, and I'm here with Anne E. Leibowitz, Visiting Professor in Residence in Music at YIVO, Dr. Neil W. Levin. Neil, thanks so much for joining us. We're continuing our conversation about YIVO's festival, Continuing Evolution Yiddish Folksong today. This is the program book for the festival, and we're going to talk a little bit about Yiddish folksong in classical music. And to get us started, Neil, can you tell us a little bit about the perhaps the most famous example, a fascinating piece written by non-Jewish composer Sergei Prokofiev?
Yes, here's an example of a piece that is standard repertoire. Every classical musician who knows chamber music, even who doesn't play chamber music, in the classical music world, the existence of this overture on Hebrew themes, it's called, which is originally written for a sextet, um, and premiered that way and so forth. I mean, other versions for orchestra and all that's very nice, but it's a sextet. And I think that orchestrating it for a larger group takes away from the particular timbres that Prokofiev wanted here, which actually, in some views, some of our colleagues have developed a kind of theory that this became a certain sound, which was string quartet, clarinet, and piano. In any event, it should not come to anyone as a revelation if they're in the music world that this piece exists. Prokofiev wrote it, the famous overture on Hebrew themes. But the story about it is extraordinary, and it still leaves us with the question: why did he do it? But then everything Prokofiev did leaves us with that question. Prokofiev is a mystery in many ways. But he went to he was living in New York at the time because he came, according to his memoirs, and I want to emphasize that because much of what we think we know about Prokofiev is only from his memoirs, which he only started writing when he went back for a reason that no one will never know for certain what that reason was. It's, people think they know, but it still doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense that he went back to the Soviet Union just at the time that Shostakovich was being denounced by the party. I mean, most of us think that Prokofiev thought that he that couldn't happen to him, that he was so above that. It's a little more complex than that, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But he left, like many artists, left as soon as they could after the Bolshevik coup in October on the Julian calendar, November on our calendar, 1917, because the revolution really happened in February. The Tsar was and his family were under house arrest. He had abdicated, and the provisional government was enforced with Kerensky, head of the provisional government. And what's called the October Revolution really wasn't revolution at all. It was a overnight coup by a tiny handful under Lenin. But of course, you know, it became called to this day, well, no, I don't know about to this day, but until 1991, the October Revolution. After that, Prokofiev thought it would be a good idea to leave and go to America because of questions. There were a lot of questions about artistic freedom. There were all kinds of assurances, but many people wisely saw through those assurances of Lenin. There was always a but. It was artists should be totally free. Don't say anything and you'll hear a but 5 seconds later. In this case, it was, but the party must guide that freedom. I'm almost quoting exactly. And Rachmaninoff had already left. Many people left. And you could leave because they had Russia. the new government had other things on its mind, an impending civil war. I mean, a few years later, and you wouldn't have been able to leave. And it was Lunacharsky, who he says in his memoirs, that's all we know, said to him, "You are a revolutionary just like we are," which was not true anyway. Prokofiev's music, not revolutionary, it's not avant-garde, it is a logical extension of Western music harmonically and every other way. Even though anything new can antagonize an audience, and his first piano concerto did so, but a little dissonance here and there that they weren't accustomed to that sort of thing. But the bottom line, he says that Lunacharsky said to him, "You really should be here because you're a revolutionary. But if you want to go to America, I won't stand in your way. Here's a visa." Now, his histories give that as fact, but we only know it because Prokofiev said so. And he didn't start writing that memoirs until he was back in the Soviet Union. And he could have had a political, I mean, he didn't, when he was writing his memoirs, he didn't know he was going to be dying soon, because he died on the same day Stalin died, coincidentally. What was that, 1953? But when he started writing his memoirs, he didn't realize that. And it's possible that he could have had some political motivation to show that Lunacharsky had considered him a revolutionary, because he was, always in danger. Everyone was in danger. Everyone was in danger of disappearing in the middle of the night in the Soviet Union, and especially under Stalin. And not just during what we call the Great Terror, which is the 1930s, but then after the war, the next terror. So he came to America, and he got married and so forth. And in 1919, he was living in New York. For a while, he lived in Chicago because his opera, I think The Love for Three Oranges. No, I could be wrong, because I often confuse that with his other the two most famous operas was The Angel of Fire, sometimes translated as The Fiery Angel, The Angel of Fire. That thing was Love for Three Oranges, was actually commissioned and being performed by Chicago Opera Company, despite a 1 year or something like that postponement. And he was also then living in New York. And he looks in the newspaper and he sees that there is a concert at Carnegie Hall titled Jewish Folk Music from Russia. That's it. So being curious, never having heard any such thing as Jewish folk music at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, obviously. And even though he later said in his memoirs, he fudged it. He said that he realized that some of those people on that program he didn't say outright that he knew them, because he didn't, at the conservatory, but they were fellow students. Maybe so, but he didn't know them there. The bottom line is, all memoirs are fudged, from Napoleon on up, down, whatever you want to call it. And presidential memoirs, whatever, I mean. And so there's usually some kernel of truth and so forth. He was curious, Jewish folk music from Russia. He had no idea what it was. Nobody in the public knew what that was. It was very clever. It was very clever advertising, because in 1919, you had a huge number of Jews living in New York on the Lower East Side. If they made a few bucks already, maybe uptown already in the Bronx or in Harlem, which was already a very upper middle class Jewish area and so forth. But they didn't know anything about Yiddish folk music. They knew about Yiddish theater music. And the music of the Yiddish theater did not avail itself, the composers, I should say, did not avail themselves at all of Yiddish folk music. Mostly because they didn't know anything about it. Because the main names on the Yiddish theater, Second Avenue, let's take the most famous names: Rumshinsky, Olshanetsky, Sholem Sekunda, and then Abe Elstein was the only one who was a native American born in New York. But those people were very urbanized in Europe. They didn't live in villages. Olshanetsky was conducting Yiddish theater and opera in Harbin, which is now China, but was then part where the railroad was being built, so it was part of the Russian Empire. Rumshinsky was conducting in Warsaw and in Lodz. So they did not bring any. As a matter of fact, Albert Weiser, the famous musicologist and historian, makes a comment in his book, The Modern Renaissance of Jewish Music, a very apt comment. He says it's a pity that they didn't ever avail themselves of Yiddish folk song in the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of Yiddish musical shows that were written from up through the heyday of Second Avenue all the way up till it started to peter out at the, in the 50s, early 50s, late 40s, actually. He said, because had they, we would have had a much better repertoire of Yiddish theater music. And he has a very good point there. Not that there aren't beautiful songs, but most of them really are more drawn on American popular songs of the time, which doesn't mean that they don't have great beauty to them. So nobody knew what Yiddish folk song meant, is my point. And Prokofiev saw, okay, it says there's going to be a group called Zimra Ensemble, from Russia, no less, which is true. String quartet, 2 violins, viola, cello, clarinet, and piano. And the clarinetist, Simeon Bellison, was the director, the founder, the whole thing. Now, today, most really serious clarinetists know the name Simeon Bellison because he was the first clarinetist in the New York Philharmonic. After that, once he came to New York, for a long time, and more than 30 years. He was very famous. And he had a whole clarinet orchestra, something like 50 people playing every conceivable clarinet. Soprano clarinet, alto clarinet, piccolo, I mean, every clarinet you can imagine. So the Zimmer Ensemble were all people from the new Jewish national movement in music. And the Gesellschaft, who also decided to get out of Russia, but they decided to get out for a particular reason, to go to what was then Palestine via America, where they would give concerts all along the way for Zionist organizations, take the money they would get and not keep it except for expenses, and put it towards a fund, which when they got to Palestine, they were going to build a temple of art. And that was their goal, that was their idealism. So they left Russia and they played in places you cannot imagine that had Zionist organizations, in white tie and tails, in concert halls, in Omsk, in Tomsk, in Indonesia, the Zionist Organization of Indonesia. I have a picture of them playing on stage in full dress in a real audience. I mean, everywhere you can imagine. And then and each place they raised some money. I've collected the programs from these things. What did they play? They played pieces based on Yiddish folk song, but that were not that were made into full 3 or 4 movement string quartets that he then had made for sextet. So he took pieces that were for symphony orchestra. He had a whole bunch of pieces arranged, enough for many concerts, all rearranged for that combination: piano, clarinet, and string quartet. And you could, go back and forth a little bit and all that. And the Zimmer Ensemble left, and they went across the Pacific. They played in Chicago at the annual convention of the Zionist Federation. I don't remember if it was the Zionist Federation or the ZOA, because 2 separate organizations, the Zionist Organization of America, but their annual convention was in Chicago. So they performed, and one of the critics for the General newspaper said that was the highlight of the whole convention. Nobody had heard of such a thing, playing string quartets, a la Haydn, a la Bartok, whatever, on Yiddish folk song structures and bases. And now they arrive, and they went to Montreal and so forth. They arrive in New York, and that's their concert at Carnegie Hall. But Prokofiev thinks he's going to hear Yiddish folk song. I mean, sung the way you would if he went to the Pale and heard without accompaniment and all that. He was curious, so he went. and he was bowled over. So he went backstage, he met the people, and Bellison, he said, now it's not clear. His memoirs say something, one thing, and Bellison's memoirs say another. It doesn't really matter who asked who. Whose idea? Did he say, I'd like to try my hand at writing a piece, which would have been typical Prokofiev? Or did Bellison say, why don't you write a piece for us? Doesn't matter. Whatever happened is the next day he went to Bellison's hotel room, and Bellison gave him a notebook of Yiddish folk song melodies. He chose one or two that he wanted to start working on. And he went and he wrote this piece. And the following year, because the sequel is, I'm not spoiling anything for anyone because none of the six ever made it out of New York. The lure of America killed their idealism. They never went to Palestine. They never built the Temple of the Art. Bellison was offered the position in the New York Philharmonic. The cellist, Chernyavsky, got involved in Yiddish vaudeville and Yiddish theater, touring with vaudeville groups and this and that. The violist became a well-known viola teacher living on the Upper West Side, so forth and so on. But the following year, they were giving a second concert. It was so successful. Carnegie Hall was packed. The reviewer said that Carnegie Hall was packed that night for the first time in years. There wasn't a seat available. Because the idea to hear Jewish folk song from Russia, nobody knew they were going to hear it in the form of string quartets. But they came back. They came back. They didn't say, hey, I don't want this highfalutin classical music. Think about that. And so Prokofiev went home and wrote the piece. And it was premiered. Actually, it wasn't premiered at the next Carnegie Hall, but it was premiered just before that. And then again, played it at the following year's Carnegie Hall concert. It was premiered at a club, at a music club on the East Side. And the only difference was that they quite appropriately let Prokofiev be the pianist instead of the usual pianist. And that is the origin of this piece, which is standard repertoire. Now, the song that he chose, that he was most interested with, was a song, a folk song that had to do with what we were talking about, which is saying goodbye, the pain of saying goodbye, particularly in the case of soldiers going into the army, and not even necessarily to war, just going off to the army, to military service. In any case, this became a major work of the chamber music repertoire. And it's the only time Prokofiev ever did anything Jewishly. Insofar as everything we know about Prokofiev, I mean, it's a total enigma. He didn't really have any particular political leanings, as far as we know. In his letters and his writings, couldn't care less one way or the other about anything political, which means there's no reason to suspect that he had any feelings one way or the other about Jews. Certainly not any anti-Semitic feelings. I should say anti-Jewish feelings. But he loved challenges, which may explain his behavior after he went back. But why he chose to do this, other than that he was just interested. It's just one more thing that interested him. And he was taken with the melosh of Yiddish folk song that night. The sound of it, the modality, the emotional tremors of it and so forth. And thought to himself, hey, I'd like to write a piece like that. I mean, that's perfectly natural. But keep in mind that Prokofiev cannot be pigeonholed into any category of composer. That's true of a lot of composers, but probably more so in his case than anyone else. More so than Leonard Bernstein. And I'll tell you why. Yes, Leonard Bernstein wrote some of the world's greatest Broadway music, and he wrote great classical music. But his classical music is not anywhere near on a par with the Broadway music. But Prokofiev wrote Peter and the Wolf and Romeo and Juliet with the same brilliance that he wrote the piano concertos. I mean, there's nothing quite like Prokofiev. It's impossible to classify him. And suddenly, I mean, he wasn't. He was doing okay in the United States. I mean, in 1919, he was a little bit depressed, a little. Although the opera was coming, the performance in Chicago, so maybe he needed something to do. But then he became, of course, I mean, famous Prokofiev. And let's remember that in his lifetime, he was as much a world famous virtuoso pianist as he was a composer. And we don't remember him that way, probably correctly, in the way we remember Rachmaninoff as equally a giant of the piano, but as a composer. But he was giving piano recitals and concerts with orchestra all over the world. And including even when he lived in America, he went back at least once to the Soviet Union for a concert tour as a pianist. And it's true, he says in his memoirs again, but this probably is true, when he went back, he realized that suddenly he was well known there. And maybe he thought he would be more appreciated there. It's hard to say, but he was plenty appreciated in the United States. Whatever it is, he decided to go back with his wife. And it was very strange. And when he went back, he still, just as he had, but he hadn't gone yet, Shostakovich was denounced by the party. And he still could have changed his mind, but he didn't. He went back. And with absolutely no invitation or pressure whatsoever at that period, as opposed to after the war, he started to write these huge pieces praising Stalin as the great Soviet hero, almost praising the terror. Huge pieces. They're not worth very much musically anyway. About the October Revolution. I mean, and nobody knows why he did that, because there was a festival in New York of his music and these pieces. I don't remember when, not that long ago, but I don't know what that means. In other words, I don't know, maybe in the 90s. And I don't even remember his name, or I would have no problem mentioning. Whoever wrote about it in the New York Times ignorantly said, poor Prokofiev, it must have been odious to him to be forced to write these pieces. It wasn't odious, and he wasn't forced, and he wasn't even pressured, and he had nothing whatsoever to gain from it. But he also didn't care politically about anything. The only thing he had to gain but he had it anyway, was the freedom to leave and come back to give piano recitals or concerts in Western Europe. But that doesn't explain it. Now, in 1948, that's a different story, because in the late 1940s, he was denounced by the party, and he had to fall in line, and I'd be lucky. But in the 30s, there wasn't even a pressure on him. Stalin considered it a coup that somebody so famous, who could have lived materially so well in the West, chose to come back to the Soviet Union. This was a major coup for Stalin. Even if Stalin had nothing to do with bringing him back, we don't know. So we don't know why he did that. But I recently heard an interview with one of the greatest pianists of all time, Sviatoslav Richter, a Soviet pianist, and one of the Gedolim, as we say in Yiddish, one of the giants. And he asked him about Prokofiev. He was already about 80 years old, Richter. And he said something very interesting. He said, of course, Prokofiev was a whore. I mean, everybody knows that. He had no principles. He said, but I think there's another explanation. He said, I think he just did that to show, hey, you see, I can do anything. I can even do that. And I thought about it, and I said, that sounds like a flippant statement. It's actually a very profound statement. And I think it explains Prokofiev to a great degree. it reminds me of the fact that Jascha Heifetz, one of the 5 greatest violinists in the history of the world, and some views might say the greatest violinist of all, whatever, but let's say certainly one of the 5 in the 20th century, the greatest violinists in all, was always bothered by the fact that he couldn't write first-rate pop songs. It bothered him a lot. I know somebody who knew him well, worked for him. I mean, he did write a couple under the name Jim Hoyle, because he wanted to use the same initials, hoping that he would be famous enough so he wouldn't have to change the initials on his luggage. JH. And Bing Crosby did him a favor and recorded 2 of them. I think 2. But I don't even remember what they were, because he was not as great a pop songwriter as he was a violinist. And that bothered him. And Richter was suggesting that maybe there was something Prokofiev wanted to show. There was nothing he couldn't do. And maybe that was why he wrote the overture. But it's a marvelous piece, like most of his pieces written out of artistic motivation. It's tightly constructed, it's well constructed. You hear the Jewish folk melosh, and you hear Prokofiev. And I think that's why it is a piece of standard repertoire.
Let's talk about Copland's Vitebsk in our last 15 minutes or so that we have together.
Vitebsk is also a piece of standard repertoire of chamber music. It's a piano trio, which means piano, violin, and cello. Aaron Copland, as we all know, was the prime mover, whatever you want to call it, of truly American classical music. I mean, to some extent, and I can't go into the details now, to some extent, Charles Ives set some precedent before that, but nothing like Aaron Copland. First place, Charles Ives was primarily interested in New England things, whereas Copland went across the country, Rodeo, Appalachian Spring, and so forth. And second place, Ives' best music, like his 4th Symphony, is a little bit much for the average concert goer to handle, unfortunately, because it's great music. Copland was and will always remain the creator of a truly American classical music. Just as Jerome Kern said about Irving Berlin, he said Irving Berlin was American music. One of the New York Times critics, I think it was Tim Page, said the same could be said about Aaron Copland with regard to classical music. Well, Copland grew up in a typical Jewish family of non-Orthodox but traditional in Brooklyn Heights. His father was even president of the synagogue, which still is a functioning, quite a functioning synagogue in Brooklyn Heights. And the rabbi of that synagogue was also a cantor, very famous Goldfarb, who composed the probably most popular melody for Shalom Aleichem that we all, Shalom Aleichem Malachei, okay. Copland, when he became a bar mitzvah, which meant at midnight on his 13th birthday, he was a bar mitzvah. It was celebrated the next Shabbos in that synagogue and so forth. And then when a few years later, he wrote one of his first pieces, was a cello piece for cello and piano called Lament, to a tune for Adon Olam, not one that anyone remembers anymore, except maybe in the Deep South, but it was popular at the time in classical reform and conservative synagogues, so it was a beautiful melody. It actually came from England and English Jewry, and he wrote a piece for it. You can't get that piece now. I mean, I have it, but you can't get it because he withdrew it from publication, forbid it to be recorded and everything because it's called Juvenalia. It's a very lovely little piece. Outside of that, and then late in life, agreeing to arranging in a sophisticated way a Hebrew-Palestinian folk song, Banu, the only substantive piece of Jewish connection that he ever wrote was Vitebsk. What happened there, he went to the theater. We don't have time to go into this now, but many people will know about simply the most famous Yiddish play ever written the Dybbuk by Ansky. And why it never became a piece of Russian literature is a very interesting question, because Ansky wrote it in Russian first. And the Moscow Art Theater said it's not going to go. You got to be Jewish to understand it. I don't think that's true. I've discussed this with a lot of people, including people at YIVO. And but that was the assumption then. So he translated it into a Yiddish play, the Dybbuk, and it premiered in Vilna about a month after he died. But then Bialik, Chaim Nachman Bialik, the great poet laureate of Hebrew poetry, made a Yiddish version, not just a translation, because many people think that it is superior to the Yiddish version in many ways. It's
Hebrew
not
version.
huh?
A Hebrew version.
The Hebrew version, yes. And that was taken on by Habima, the theatrical troupe that did Hebrew theater. They did it all over in Berlin. In fact, when they did it in Berlin, they were in residence in Berlin in the 1920s in the Hebrew version. And of course, as you know, Habima became the National Theater of Israel eventually. When they were in residence in Berlin, the reviewer for one of the major newspapers in Berlin, of course, was not Jewish. He went anyway. That's how famous this was. And he wrote the next morning, quote, "Of course, I could not understand one word of it, but I could tell from the way it was pronounced and performed that this must have been the language in which God spoke to the ancient Israelites when he was in his best mood." Isn't that great? Well, they also came to New York on tour. The problem is we don't really know for certain which Copland saw. Habima's production, which would have been in Hebrew, or one of at least two other productions that were done in that time frame in an English translation. My vote is for one of the English translations, but we don't know for certain. I mean, he wouldn't have understood one word of it in modern Hebrew. Very few people, only modern Hebraists in New York would have understood it without. On the other hand, we just don't know. Whatever it is, he went to a play of the performance of the Dybbuk. Now, Joel Engel wrote an entire suite of incidental music for the Dybbuk for the Hebrew production, for Bialik's version. We don't know what music was done for the Yiddish play, except for the probability of one song that Yansky heard in Europe and attached it to this, which we know more for its Hebrew, Mipnei Ma, but actually in the Yiddish play, of course, it's sung in Yiddish, Machmas Vos. And that song, whether or not Engel's music was used for productions, that song has generally been part of it, because it opens the play, it closes the play, it can be done in the middle of the play as well, and it has to do with the theme, which is a highly mystical Hasidic notion of the soul descending only to arise. So for mipnei ma means for what, why, how did it happen, however you want to translate it, that the soul descended to its lowest lows before reascending to its highest highs. Okay. And it has to do with, this play has to do with demonic possession. And that was a thing in Eastern Europe that people didn't know existed until they went there and saw, yeah, people still believed in this stuff, in demonic possession. So Copland was fascinated with that tune, because whatever production he went to, if he went to the Hebrew production, they might have done Engel's incidental music for the whole play. If he went to one of the English ones, they probably didn't. But they still did the Mipnei Ma or Machmas Vos tune to open it, because as the play opens, the people in the synagogue are singing that melody by the instruction of the script. And he was fascinated with the tune. And so he went home and he wrote a piano trio. And that's what later became called Vitebsk. Now, that was in 1929. He managed to get a commission to write it, but he would have done it anyway, by an existing piano trio in New York. And it was premiered in 1929 in New York. The odd thing about it was, later, he couldn't have known that it was premiered with a trio whose pianist, and they had commissioned this, was on the one hand one of the great pianists of the 20th century, especially for the Germanic repertoire, but also for the French repertoire, as I should say, equally for Debussy and Ravel, although he was very German. Walter Gieseking, who was one of the most egregious collaborators with the murder of 6 million Jews, and never, in fact, got angry that anyone even brought that up after the war. Nobody would go to hear Gieseking when he came to the United States after the war. It was a total failure. His only regret was that Germany hadn't won the war. I know people who were at the recital who heard him say in the dressing room, "Let's get out of here. It stinks of Jews here." Yeah, this was in Chicago. And yet, he didn't feel that way in 1929, which is a little scary. It's a little scary because it could mean that it only took a few years to make men into beasts. I mean, in Japan, that's certainly what happened. It only took a few years. Or it could mean that it was under the surface for 100 years in German culture, which it was, but not to that extent, and so on. Whatever it was, they were the world premiere, and he called the trio Vitebsk. Now, Vitebsk, this has caused tremendous ignorance, because on on the recordings of it or concert programs, the visual imagery has been of what we call, sometimes incorrectly, a shtetl, a little Jewish village, which is not really a shtetl, it's a market town, a little market town, but a market town, that's what it means. But whatever, it has Marc Chagall imagery on it from that period in Chagall's painting, but that's only one part of Chagall. That's a later period. And so the assumption is that Vitebsk is a little village in the Pale where people sang Yiddish folk songs, like the folk song that he picked and all that. But that's not true. Anyone who went, I think it's about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, there was a wonderful Chagall exhibition at the Jewish Museum in New York. And one of the first things that I pointed out to the people I were with there, I said, take a look at this. This is pictures of Vitebsk with streetcars and warehouses and factories. This is a major city. It had nothing to do with the shtetl of folk life and folk ways. So why did he name it Vitebsk? Did he not know any better? No. I mean, he knew nothing of Jewish history, Jewish life anyway. He chose to be an atheist, which he has every right to Jews. He still felt a strong kinship, nonetheless, or he wouldn't have written his arrangement in much later in life to Hebrew Palestinian folk song. And he did. He spoke about it. He even gave a lecture in Israel in the 1950s about how there's Jewishness somehow to all his work. So it's not that. It happens that Vitebsk was the city where the Communist Art League was born. It happens that Vitebsk was the city of the first, the 1 year anniversary preparations for the 1 year anniversary of what they called the October Revolution. It happens that Vitebsk was the home of the Communist Art School, where Chagall had studied before that, and now he was head of it. It has and in 1929, Vitebsk had the Jewish Communist League established there. And Narkompros, where Lunacharsky was head of the Jewish, not Jewish, the League of Soviet Culture, I guess is one of the best translations. I don't think this was a mistake. I think this was already Copland's flirtation with communism, which is a complicated subject, which affected, I would say, most artists at that time, but not all. Whether they were writers, composers, some more than others, Um, on the one hand, on the other hand, was it as he was charged in 1953, his piece, A Lincoln Portrait, which is one of his most famous pieces with a narration and all that of words of Abraham Lincoln, was supposed to be performed at the inaugural concert for President Eisenhower. Think about it, in those days, even for President Eisenhower was not a aficionado of classical music. He still had a classical music concert, not like today for the inauguration of a president. And although Eisenhower, I have to say, was very encouraging right after the war and during the occupation of classical music programming and concerts for during the occupation. Very encouraging. In any case, some right-wing Republicans who were still ticked off that Eisenhower had been the nominee instead of Taft, who was supposed to be in 1952, got wind of this, and they quickly looked it up without the use of Google in 1953 and realized that, yes, that Copland had belonged to all or been somehow involved with all sorts of far left organizations. In some respect, the composers group in the 1920s was funded from Moscow, from the party in Moscow. That's true. And in other cases, just far left. The organizations for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade in the Spanish Civil War. Yes, we now know that it was funded from Moscow, but not everyone who participated in that knew that or believed that. There's a lot of gray area here. Anyway, they listed a whole bunch of things in the newspaper and had his piece canceled from the concert in Washington on the Mall in 1953 on the grounds of that made him disloyal. Now, whatever one says about the stupidity and the naivete, the impolitic of association with these groups in the 1930s, it's not necessarily disloyalty to advocate voting for the Communist Party. It's not the same thing as, and I am the last person in the world to come to the defense of this, but you cannot say that Copland was disloyal to America. They had the crazy notion, as I wrote in my essay, I would bet you dollars to donuts. Copland could not have defined communism. He could not have told you the difference between, he couldn't have defined capitalism, which is only two words, markets and property. That's it. He couldn't have told you the difference between Trotsky views and Stalin. Nothing. Nor could any of these other artists. They thought it seemed like a good utopian idea that would go further and faster than the New Deal. But actually, in 1940, the Communist Party realized they weren't going to win at election time, and they told everybody of their members to vote for President Roosevelt because they knew that any alternative would be a disaster, which it would have been. America probably would have pulled out of Europe if Roosevelt hadn't been president and made a deal with Hitler. So, there's a lot of interest to this. And then, frankly, later in life, what I admire about Copland is he didn't try to cover for any of that. We know, why did he write Rodeo? Why did he write Appalachian Spring, in which he incorporated a Shaker religious tune? Did he do that because he said, hey, I want to be an American composer and that out there is the real America? No. He did that because the Communist Party USA mandated composers to do that as a strategy to show them that the Communist Party wasn't just a New York clique that we cared about, that we, the Communist Party, are just as interested of the rank and file. By the way, the folk. The
common man.
The common man. And that his piece, Fanfare for the Common Man.
Exactly.
But it doesn't matter. These are brilliant pieces of music. They are Americana. And at the end of the day, late when he was doing his kind of autobiography interview with Vivian Perlis, of course, the subject came up, which is fair game. But I like the fact that he said, look, I didn't actually ever join anything. And that's mostly true. But it wouldn't have even mattered because the Communist Party USA, as vile as it was in the early years, by the 1930s was not taking orders from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It's complex. If you want to read the history of it, probably the best is Irving Howe, the history of the American Communist Party. Um, but they had a vision. They knew that they had to create a kind of communism in the United States. Now, of course, this was idiotic, and very few people talk about the number of Jews who were Yiddish-speaking communists. I want to set the record straight right now. At its peak, in the worst days of the Depression, this is a very small number. At its peak, there was 10,000 nationally. At its peak, the workman's circle, and most of them were in New York and the Bronx, by the way. At its peak, the workman's circle, which was very vehemently anti-Soviet Union and anti-communist since 1929, but was socialist. What did socialism mean? It meant Medicare. They didn't even go that far. It meant the 8-hour day, working day. It meant Social Security. The workman's circle, the Arbeiterring, which still exists, but it doesn't have that connection anymore. It doesn't need that connection. But the Arbeiterring sang God Bless America at every meeting with the American flag. And they were, but okay, many of them voted for Norman Thomas in 1936. Nothing wrong with that. Third party socialist, patently, I would say, patriotic American. I mean, I would have voted for Roosevelt, but okay. But most of the workman's circle voted for Democratic Party. They didn't waste their vote on a third party vote. And finally, the Communist Party, USA, 1940, said, look, might as well vote Democratic. But that didn't mean the Democratic Party was socialism. Quite to the contrary. I mean, very few people understood this then. But President Roosevelt's very first mission was to save capitalism from a communist electoral victory. That's why the first thing he did was close the banks and then pursue the New Deal next, not first. And Copland came to recognize that. And when Vivian Perlis asked him about, he said, look, I never really joined anything, but he said it was the feel of the time. Well, he's absolutely right about that. And as long as he said that, you know, you could never claim that Copland was a disloyal American. I once asked a very famous composer who knew Copland well, and I said, tell me, Copland was even 1950s. Did he own property? He said, oh my God, he had a brownstone would be worth $20 million today in Brooklyn Heights. I said, how could anyone call him a communist? You can't own property. I mean, Pete Seeger was as much as this is disturbing, and as his entire behavior is disturbing, defending Stalin to the end in very strange ways. But he was true to his word. A couple years before he died, Theodore Raquel asked Pete Seeger, he said, look, you got to get a helper in here. You know, you're 85 years old, whatever, older, he was much older. He said, you can live in your own log cabin that you built with your own hands, but you need to. And he said he wouldn't have a nurse there because that would make him an employer. And a true communist cannot be an employer. No, Copland was none of that. And I would say that it will always be that he set the path for writing American music. And people came along, like Leonard Bernstein said precisely that. But the Vitebsk piece is not just a piece of Jewishly related music. It's also a piece of Americana, because where else could a composer like Copland, who by 1929 had no interest in anything Judaic, go on Broadway and hear Machmas Vos or Mipnei Ma in a regular Broadway theater, or if he heard the English version, it was in the neighborhood Playhouse Theater downtown, but it's still a major New York theater. Go home, write a piano trio that in 1 year is premiered by the likes of Walter Gieseking and the other two. That is an American phenomenon right there.
A fascinating story. Neil, thank you so much. This has
you.
been absolutely incredible.